Let's go ahead and advance the slide to what cloud means to the enterprise. And really, I'm going to take this from two perspectives. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the competitive landscape and the challenges and the advantages that companies have in making the move to the cloud. And secondly, I'm going to address the trends in the workforce that are really forcing companies to adopt more and more cloud technologies. So go ahead, let's advance the slide, Cheryl. The analogy that I like to use is just really make the case that what is going on right now is really a revolution. And the analogy that we make is in comparison it to the Industrial Revolution in the late 1800s last century. The picture that you see on the left-hand side is a water wheel. And there's a famous water wheel that was developed by a gentleman named Henry Burden back in 1851. And while this one is fairly mundane, Henry's water wheel was 60 feet tall, it weighed 250 tons, and it could generate, here's the key, it could generate 500 horsepower, okay? So Henry was an entrepreneur. Let's back the slide up there, okay, sorry. Henry was an entrepreneur, and what his company did was he had a company called Henry Burden's Iron Works, and one of the products that he produced was horseshoes, right? So if you were competing with Henry back in those days and you were banging out horseshoes with the hammer and an anvil, you really couldn't compete with Henry, because this power plant that he generated in his company there could produce a horseshoe one every second. He was able to win the contract with the Union Army during the Confederate War, and he was producing horseshoes. So for a competitive advantage, you couldn't compete with Henry in his horseshoeing machine, right? And that's because he was able to generate power on his own. Yes, maybe 25% of his staff were generating that power, but it provided him really an unfair competitive advantage in the industry. Okay, move time forward another 50 years. Cheryl, would you just back up, please? Thank you. Move time forward another 50 years, and that water wheel is really completely obsolete. The fact it was no longer necessary. Why? Because you look on the right-hand side, what changed? Well, it turned out that it was more cost-effective, more reliable to get your energy from massive coal-burning power plants. You could put your factory wherever you wanted to, maybe closer to where the natural resources were, because of the alternating current in these power lines that were able to transmit power over great distances. All right? The same analogy is taking place in the computer revolution. Right? Nobody will argue that when the computers automated the tasks that people were doing by hand and through ledgers, it provided companies a tremendous competitive advantage. And companies are continuing to leverage that. The difference now is that instead of having to maintain that IT infrastructure in your back room and using your own staff, it is much more cost-effective and reliable to be able to get your IT resources from these massive data centers, which are known as the cloud. Okay, so what exactly are we talking about? Let's move to the next slide here. And what is the cloud? Well, as you can see, the analogy of the coal-burning power plant is these massive data centers, right? Inside them, there's going to be maybe thousands of computers all lined up in rows after row after rows, right? They're designed for redundancy. If one computer goes down, it falls back to the next system, and will allow things to continue to move forward. And even if to get into these places is quite a feat. You see these massive 10-foot fences wrapped around it, and there's no windows in these buildings, and there's maybe retina scanners that verify that only authorized personnel are able to get into the environment. They're very secure, very reliable, and even if you did maybe rappel through the top through those air conditioning ducts, and you got into the infrastructure and you grabbed one of these computers that are in there, you end up with maybe just useless data, maybe 1/1000th of what any one company would use, because this data is obfuscated. It's spread across so many systems, and in order to be available for this redundant type of environment. So compare what you're seeing here compared to your own enterprise and your data center, your IT room, your computer room that you got in the back. It's really non-comparable, right? How cost-effective, how reliable that you'll be able to achieve when you've got a whole squadron of people that do nothing but to maintain these massive infrastructures for hundreds or thousands of different companies. In the same area on security, these firms have, PhDs in computer science who spend all day, all the time, just making sure that this information is locked down. So what that really means is that those of us who are maybe not Fortune 500 companies are able to get the same kind of advantages that would only be available through, the largest companies in the world. Okay, let's move on to the next slide, Cheryl. And we'll talk about the redundancy. So not only are these individual computers designed for failure and redundancy, and if a pod of systems computers fail out, they fall over to another pod, but these in total data centers are redundant. And so here's a sample of where these are located across the world. And the idea is if your primary source of computing resources is in California and there's a failover, it can fall back to Chicago or ultimately over to Europe or wherever it might be. Again, providing the reliability that companies just normally can't provide for themselves. I mean, I know I worked for companies that we attempt to do this on our own. We put a server back east, and we're trying to build this infrastructure. We just can't provide it at the cost effectiveness that these major providers are able to do. All right. So next slide. So bottom line is, with cloud computing, companies can achieve the security, the reliability, the availability that really were traditionally limited to Fortune 500 companies. Okay, next I want to talk about really the workforce trends and the challenges that we have as executives running our companies, and what we're facing with, and how the cloud allows us to address these challenges, right? There's no doubt that our staff, our people, are being much more collaborative than they used to, right? They're much more mobile, and they're much more device agnostic. And this is a huge challenge to the typical IT organization who's used to having this kind of control. Right? If we're collaborating with our external suppliers, we're working from client sites, we're using devices that weren't purchased by the company, we have challenges that really the cloud's going to be able to address. But let's take a closer look at that. Next slide talks about the mobile workforce, all right? So look at the employee behaviors that are going on now, right? A third of us work outside the office on a regular basis, right? 75% of us choose the technology that we use, right? We choose the mobile, our mobile devices. And most of us prefer the tools that we have at home over the tools, the technology that our IT infrastructure that we have given to us at work. All right. So this is the challenges that we have. This comes from a Forrester report a couple of years back. Let's move forward and talk about how people connect. This is a story this weekend on Sunday night. I'm talking to my son. He's 17 years old, and he said he was telling me about this new girlfriend that he had, and how he spent Saturday with his new girlfriend, and I was very perplexed, and I was trying to understand, well, how did this work? Where were you? And it turns out that this girlfriend of his is actually in Finland, and he spent the entire day in his room dialoguing and hanging out with his new girlfriend, and just the way that people work together is totally different. They don't come into the office anymore, right? My son fully felt that he was every well as engaged with this new girlfriend of his as if they actually did what you and I might have done, is head down to the 7-Eleven corner store back when we were kids, right? So people are connecting over great distances, and that's how they're collaborating. Next slide. And where is work taking place? Well, work isn't taking place where it traditionally did, at our desks. This is no surprise, right? A third of us work from places like client sites, coffee shops, public locations. 4 out of 10 of us regularly are working from home, right? So the typical PC provided by the company with the antivirus, controlled by Active Directory, accessed through a VPN, really are just, we don't have those kind of controls any longer. Okay, next slide. Multiple devices, right? So the average worker today doesn't just access it through access company assets through their PC. You know, they're using smartphones, they're using tablets, and they're consistently working across these different devices. So to be able to have to access data traditionally was maybe sitting on one's C drive is no longer available, right? And no longer an option, because I need to be able to have that information whether I'm on my tablet, whether I'm on my smartphone, whether I'm on my desk, whether I'm at a client site. So how are we going to address all of that? Okay. Next slide. Let's talk about the BYOD, bring your own device, right? 3 out of 4 employees use their smartphone or tablet for work every single day, right? Most companies now are implementing some kind of a BYOD environment, which is supposed to grow to the norm here in just a few years. 85% of companies are going to allow companies to bring their own devices to work, right? So as BYOD becomes more standard, there's the need to be able to work across the diversity of employee-owned devices, and companies aren't going to be able to implement apps that don't meet their users' expectations and the ease of use that they're used to. Okay, this is next slide here talks about the perception that our staff has, that they have better technology at home than they do at work. And that is because the tools that were typically provided to our staff were meeting the needs of the IT buyer, right? The purchasing organization who's negotiating over cost and controls and things like that, which really limit the flexibility of our end users. So when you ask them, how do you like to work, they prefer the types of tools that they have at home. And this is really one of the reasons why Google and Google Apps have been so successful, because the Google applications were built, you know, really from the bottom up. They're designed for the ease of use on the end user, and now we're able to bring those ease of use applications to the enterprise. Let's go to the next slide here, Cheryl. We can kind of wrap up, and that's really the, you know, how we're going to transition this presentation, because Google Apps has taken the tools that the workers are using at home and really making them available for work, right? You can work anywhere, anytime, any kind of a platform, and really have the kind of collaboration and real-time communication that your workers demand, or what they're getting, just like my son Scott did over the weekend with his friends. Okay, so to talk a little bit more about this, let me turn this back over to Cheryl, and she'll make the transition specifically over to the Google offering.